Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Noor Kokiar. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State China Relations Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar titled China's Strategic Ambitions. Our moderator and panelists will provide us with their thoughts on whether China's recent actions in places like the skies off Taiwan, the border with India, or the South China Sea are one-off incidents or part of an overall grand strategy. We're also going to explore some of the responses of the US to these developments. I'm really pleased to note that today's session is a collaborative effort between the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Washington State China Relations Council. Speaking on behalf of the Council, I look forward to further cooperation with NBR. The Washington State China Relations Council was founded in 1979, and it's the oldest state-level organization of its kind. Our mission is to improve the bilateral relationship between Washington State and China, specifically in the area of business, government, culture, and education. Since the onset of the pandemic, we've produced many webinars on China-related topics. We'd encourage today's participants to look at our website to see our upcoming events and to review the recordings of our past events. Please do also contact us if you'd like to be put on our mailing list. And now I'm going to ask Jennifer Lee Dotson of the National Bureau of Asian Research to introduce her organization and also to introduce today's speakers. Jennifer.
谢谢 Noor, and aloha everyone. As Vice President of Philanthropy, my role is to help expand our network of partners, and thanks to an introduction from my former boss, Dr. Bob Kapp, I met Noor and Man right before the pandemic. Well, now here we are for our first joint event together. The National Bureau of Asian Research is the nation's Asia policy think tank based in Seattle and Washington, D.C. that helps decision makers better understand Asia and craft policy for over 30 years. Our website is nbr.org. It is my pleasure to introduce the president of NBR, Roy Camphausen. Roy became NBR's president in 2019 after serving as senior vice president for research since 2015. In 2018, he was appointed by Senator Mitch McConnell as a commissioner to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission. Roy was a U.S. Army Foreign Area Officer with previous assignments on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. Embassy, Beijing. He holds degrees from Wheaton College and Columbia University. It is also my pleasure to introduce our NBR non-resident fellow, a great friend and a colleague, Tiffany Ma. Tiffany is Senior Director at Bauer Group Asia, that directs and advises Fortune 500 companies on public policy issues. Tiffany regularly writes and speaks on China-Taiwan relations, U.S.-China relations, and Asia-Pacific maritime security. She holds degrees from Harvard University and the University of New South Wales in Australia. Our moderator today is Dimitri Sevastopoulos, U.S.-China correspondent for Financial Times, covering foreign policy, national security, trade, economics, and business. Dimitri spent over a decade living in Tokyo, Beijing, and Hong Kong in between his two postings in Washington, D.C. He holds degrees from Trinity College in Ireland and Harvard University. May I please remind all our guests today to press your mute button. To submit a question, please use the chat box function, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the WSCRC website within 48 hours. I will now turn the virtual microphone over to Roy Camphausen. Roy?
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me join you in saying what a treat it is for us at NBR to join with the Washington State China Relations Council in this event. Thank you so much, Noor and Man. It's also a pleasure to speak alongside my longtime colleague, Tiffany Ma. I always am very glad to learn from her perspectives. And having Dimitri as our moderator, he's simply one of the world's best journalists on China, is just an added benefit. Let me make 4 quick points at the outset. And when in my comments, I use the shorthand of China, I'm referring to the People's Republic of China led by the Chinese Communist Party. Please be clear that I'm referring to that state, not Chinese people everywhere, and especially not our fellow citizens here in the United States. First point, China's military, the People's Liberation Army, is regionally focused, albeit with growing global aspirations and capabilities. It's true that the PLA Navy has joined Gulf of Aden anti-piracy operations since 2008, some 38 rotations of 3 to 4 naval task group organizations. They do have a base in Djibouti at the Horn of Africa, established in August 2017. There are more facilities and activities in Africa and South America. And yes, China is a space power with modernizing and growing nuclear weapons capabilities as well. But the main game for the PLA is still in Asia. This is where its core military interests lie, especially the East-South China Seas and Taiwan. That leads to my second introductory point. Chinese security goals and American security goals in East Asia, certainly within what we call the first island chain, are irreconcilable. Put simply, for reasons related to historical grievance and antiquated perceptions about the security provided by more geographic space, China wants the US military to operate further from the Asian mainland. As a Pacific power, consider that the US territory of Guam is less than half the distance to Tokyo as it is to Hawaii, with 5 important allies in Asia and deep commitments to regional security, and with a 2 centuries-long strategy to deter the emergence of an Asian hegemon, the US simply cannot contemplate the pullback Beijing would seek. The challenge is how to manage this irreconcilable reality and the rising security tensions it entails without accommodating China's excessive and aggressive actions or putting at risk American allies and prestige, and doing that all without going to war. Third, the PLA has undertaken a remarkable period of reform and advancing of its military capabilities. Consider that the PLA budget has grown 25-fold since 1989, enabled by the amazing Chinese economic miracle. Despite this dramatic growth, however, PLA spending as a percentage of total government spending has changed little in the last decade, still only about 5.5% of the total budget, a level far less than the United States. In certain dimensions, the PLA has world-class military capabilities, hypersonics, short and intermediate ballistic missiles be among them. And with the latest structural reforms in 2016 and 17, the PLA is a much more externally oriented joint force. There's also a new willingness to use force in ways not previously seen. Consider India in the summer of 2020. And war games reveal serious challenges for the United States and her allies in East Asia and East Asian contingencies. Lots of Chinese naval warships and missiles make a conflict in East Asia a forbidding prospect. Nevertheless, the fourth point, the PLA has real limitations. They have no wartime experience in more than 4 decades. The PLA has this risk-averse strategic culture that makes decisive action more difficult to contemplate. There's also concerns about the loyalty of PLA leaders by top Chinese Communist Party officials. Witness the anti-corruption campaign as a means to help root out these problems. In PLA writings about its own shortcomings, concerns about the faculties of its officer corps have been characterized as 2 inabilities and 5 incapables, a damning indictment of military readiness. And Xi Jinping himself, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the state president, and the chairman of the Central Military Commission, is himself not sure that the PLA is up to the task militarily. He says they suffer from peace disease. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis put it this way to his PLA counterpart, Wei Fenghe, in 2018. He said, "The kind of military I always want to take into combat is one in which 80% of its officers have experience leading in an environment in which live bullets are being fired. The kind of adversary I want, General, is one where the opposite is true." Taiwan is the place where this all comes together. And now I'm glad to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Tiffany Ma.
Great, thank you so much, Roy, and my thanks to MBR and the Washington State China Relations Council for having me here today, and appreciate everyone on the line taking time in their afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are, to join us for this discussion. I want to build on Roy's comments about what we've seen in terms of China's growing military power. And in essence, I mean, China has defied any hopes and expectations that as a growing power that it would seek to be a responsible stakeholder in the US-led liberal democratic order. China's actions in recent years have really underscored that it is not a status quo power. And under Xi Jinping, China has sought to create essentially an external environment that is conducive to China's national interests, rather than advancing China's interests within the international system. China's strategic interest now spans its land and maritime boundaries all the way to the Arctic, where it has designated itself as a near-Arctic state, despite being over 3,000 miles between Beijing and the North Pole. But I do want to draw attention to what China considers to be its core interests, and that is Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and more recently to be South China Sea, because we should distinguish these as elevated concerns from Beijing's perspective. In particular, Taiwan, it still remains the top contingency for PLA planning and preparations. And Taiwan is also an issue that really fans Chinese nationalism like no other, whether it's a representation of Taiwan on a map, or actor John Cena recently alluding to Taiwan as a country. There's no issue, I think, too small when it comes to Taiwan to draw the nationalist attentions in China. And China's strategies and pressure tactics against Taiwan does provide us with some really valuable insights into how China is pursuing its strategic ambitions and how China challenges US interests in Asia as well. We've seen in recent years that China has stepped up coercive measures to compel Taiwan towards its preferred goal of unification with the PRC, and to persuade the government and people in Taiwan that unification is an inevitable outcome. We've seen regular incursions by PLA Air Force into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and with the largest incursion to date happening on June 15th, so very recently as well. And other military pressures we've seen include circumnavigation of the island with China's aircraft carrier, live fire exercises, including some based on invasion scenarios. So this creates a highly destabilizing situation in the Taiwan Strait. And moreover, what we've seen in recent years is an approach by China that has been coined as what we call sharp power, and that is tactics to unilaterally change the status quo by using means beyond the military to include economic, political, and diplomatic spheres. And China does this often by sort of politicizing unconventional spaces and really co-opting the openness of democratic institutions like those on Taiwan. So just to give a few examples, politically, we've seen China's interference in recent Taiwan elections, where there's been attempts to interfere in the news and social media through malicious content, for example, to sort of shape the perception of the candidates and the parties, and also to alter the parameters of the political discourse on Taiwan. Economically, we've seen the politicization of the name Taiwan itself, and that has applied to global companies such as airlines and hotels, for example. And there's also been, China has also been using sort of punitive economic measures against Taiwan or other countries that criticize China. So one of the most recent examples was China banning exports of pineapple from Taiwan, which led to actually quite a successful social media campaign led by Taiwan to support quote unquote freedom pineapples, which saw, I think, Secretary Pompeo posting and tweeting a picture of himself with pineapple cakes. And diplomatically, and this is one of the most concerning spaces, in what we call Taiwan's international space, we've seen that China has really pressured Taiwan by whittling down its diplomatic allies, restricting Taiwan's participation in international organizations, and most problematically, in the World Health Assembly. In the middle of a pandemic, Taiwan has not been able to sort of share its successful containment of COVID-19 because of the cross-strait politics. So the cross-strait situation really illustrates how China is building its military, its economic, its diplomatic, and its political power, and also leveraging them to assert its interests both regionally and globally. And while China doesn't necessarily seek to confront the United States, it's clear that it is certainly much more willing to challenge US interests and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. So I'll end there because I know we're going to have a lively discussion. So, Dimitri?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. And I'd like to thank Jennifer and Noor for taking a risk on having someone with an Irish accent moderate an event in North America. Let me jump straight in, just to kind of sum up some of the things that Tiffany and Roy, you both said. If you think about Chinese behavior right now, whether it's the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the crackdown on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, assertive military activity around Taiwan in the South China Sea or around the Senkaku in the East China Sea, and then the economic coercion of Taiwan and Australia and others that Tiffany was just referring to. What do you think China's overarching strategy is, and what's its goal? And maybe Tiffany, if you'd like to start.
Sure. In terms of China's overarching strategy, I mean, I think it's to really utilize all the tools that it has built across the different domains, from economic to military to political, to really create a world that is safe for China. You know, we're seeing a very different China now. It is much more ambitious under Xi Jinping. We are far away from the hide and bide strategy of the Deng era. And Xi Jinping has very ambitious goals for China, both in terms of economic prosperity, in terms of territorial sovereignty and military modernization and global leadership. So what we're seeing right now is a strategy towards national rejuvenation, which includes a few elements. So for example, economically, we're seeing them strengthen internally. The Made in China 2025 is a great example of an industrial policy that is trying to make China dominant in certain high-tech sectors. And as I mentioned, you know, we're also seeing China not afraid to use its economic leverage as carrot and sticks. So it's not just Taiwan. You mentioned Australia when it comes to agricultural and mining goods. They sanctioned Lotte in South Korea because they didn't like that system going in there. So it is quite broad in terms of how China is willing to use its leverage. And diplomatically, its strategy is to really shape international organizations where it can, or build new ones, essentially, as we have seen in terms of the AIIB, for example. And more recently, we've seen this diplomatic strategy being really aggressive. You know, there's this wolf warrior diplomacy where diplomats have been aggressively tweeting and using other social media platforms to really deflect criticism of China and to attack the United States. And, you know, at times peddle very questionable content and conspiracy theory. And I guess militarily, you know, we're seeing more active use of the military in contested domains. And I think, as Roy mentioned earlier, we're seeing the military being used in ways, new ways to pressure. So using gray zone tactics, for example, that is below the kinetic threshold, and an active, I think, an expanded military presence is another way that China is actively trying to pressure the regional states as well.
Roy, can I ask you maybe to build on that? I'm curious whether you think this Chinese strategy, is it being driven by the fact that China is just now sufficiently confident about its place in the world that it feels that the US cannot push it around, and that it has enough sway to do some of the things it's doing, and that there won't be any repercussions?
Well, Tiffany's summary was terrific. Let me add a couple of thoughts. I think there is a judgment in Beijing that the US is in a period of secular decline, beginning perhaps as early as 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis in the United States. And China judges that this presents opportunities that, paired with its own ambition and growing capabilities, allow it to be more assertive than it would have been in an earlier era when the dynamics were not quite the same. And so there's, I think, very much a sense that, and this really informs, I think, US strategy as a consequence, a sense in Beijing that maybe it's the one that can do the pushing around. And so that has created so many of these dynamics that Tiffany referred to.
Maybe just to kind of flip that around a little bit and ask you both, you know, for the first time, arguably for the first time since the US emerged as a superpower, it has a real peer competitor in a way that the Soviet Union wasn't, because it's not just about military power, it's also about economic might. We live in a more globalized world, and China is everywhere, and supply chains are much more integrated, with China being very, very important. how much of the kind of concern in the US about China is driven by the fact that the US now faces this peer competitor for the first time and doesn't quite know how to handle it? Roy, do you want to take that one first?
Sure, I think that's a fair assessment. There are vulnerabilities in US supply chains that have direct linkages in China. And so you wrote about this recently, Dimitri, the new Investment and Competition Act are intended, if it passes the Congress and is signed into law, it's intended to help reverse some of those trends. But there are great vulnerabilities in so many sectors, semiconductors being one, but also pharmaceuticals and other commodities. So I think that's certainly an important dimension that we need to keep into account.
Tiffany, do you have a sense of that?
I think what Roy said is right. I mean, I think this particular type of competition that the United States is entering with China, I think it's unique. I mean, it's very different from the competition that we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And a few ways that it's different is that China is growing its military and it's very clearly seeking parity with the United States by the middle of the century. And that was something that I think the USSR aspired to, but in the end, from hindsight, never really got there. How do we address the question of strategic competition with one of our biggest trade partners? I think that's another topic that the US policymakers are wrestling with. And, recently we've seen a lot of conversation about so-called decoupling between the United States and China. And that's a trend that's kind of been prompted by the last administration over a lot of national security concerns and also strategic competition concerns, and now driven by COVID-19 as well. So I think that is one of the biggest questions. How do we compete with a country that we have trade relations with and that we are fairly dependent on still economically in many ways?
I mean, you talked about decoupling, and I remember towards the end of the Trump administration, both the US and Chinese sides both said that relations were, at probably the lowest point, certainly since Tiananmen, and maybe even since diplomatic relations were normalized with Beijing. Do you think that the US and China are destined to enter a Cold War? And is there, what can both sides do to prevent that from happening? Roy, would you want to jump in on that one?
This is really an important question. The Cold War name, if you will, is I think a useful mobilization tool within the United States. It evokes an earlier period when we considered ourselves to have an existential threat in the Soviet Union. And so evoking that kind of image is useful for getting us at home, mobilizing the American people, our institutions, our systems, our policy for this generation-long competition. This is not something that's going to be over in an election cycle or a couple of years. And so we have to have the intestinal fortitude, you might say, for a very long period of time. Doesn't mean that war is inevitable, but it does mean that this is a different kind of condition than we've known since 1990, 1991. And so we have to get ready for it, and we have to engage. I would argue the Chinese have been in this competition for 30 plus years, and now they welcome us to the game, so to speak. They wonder why it took us so long in the United States, and they expect we'll bring our very best to it. And we owe it to ourselves, to our people, to our history, to absolutely engage in this competition with the very best that we have to offer.
Sorry, just to kind of clarify one thing. So you think the Chinese thought the US was complacent in not looking after its own interests?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Tiffany, so do you think we're in a Cold War?
I think it's very important we talk about the framing. As Roy mentioned, the term the Cold War invokes, I think, essentially a competition of a bygone era. China is seeking power and influence in part because it sees that as its sort of rightful historical place, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. And the conflict between the United States and China, I think fundamentally comes down to, I think, two core elements. One is China's revisionism in the international system, where it's seeking to build or cultivate a system that is safe for authoritarianism. And it's also a conflict, I think, between different values. The United States under the Biden administration, I think you're seeing a return to a lot of rhetoric about democracy and human rights. And, I think the actions thus far are sort of backing up that rhetoric. And that puts it very much in opposition with China, given what it's doing to erode the international order and to undermine human rights with its genocide campaign in Xinjiang.
So, I mean, at one point, the US talked about China being or becoming a responsible stakeholder, to use the phrase that Bob Zoellick coined. Do you think there was ever a chance that China would become a responsible stakeholder, or do you think that actually Washington was very naive in the way it viewed China? Tiffany, maybe you can address that.
Dimitri, you're giving out the core hard-hitting questions. I think in hindsight, we probably should not have expected China to become a responsible stakeholder. I mean, I think Kurt Campbell has said that the period of engagement is essentially over. So I think we've now shifted in terms of a bipartisan consensus on a view of China that is China as a strategic competitor. And I don't necessarily see that changing. In terms of China being a responsible stakeholder, I mean, you have to ask the question, what kind of international system does China want to see? And right now, everything that we're getting from Beijing is that they want something that the United States and a lot of its democratic allies do not want. So it's very hard to retroactively justify why we thought China would be a responsible stakeholder.
That's a perfect segue to my next question, which is that most people that I talked to in Washington didn't expect Biden to take as strong a stance on China as he has, with maybe a few exceptions. What do you both think about the way Biden is handling China? Is his approach the right one? Roy, do you want to start that?
Well, it's too early. We haven't seen what will be released publicly about the internal reviews. The defense review, for instance, is complete, but there's only hints of it so far. There's a high level of continuity with the direction of Trump administration approaches, even if the style and the inclusion of allies as a central element is very, very different from the Trump era. So it's early days. I think it's also fair to say that that the Biden administration has been intent on communicating to China and the world that China is not a top 5 priority for it. Its priorities are domestic, they're alliance related, they're how we deal effectively with COVID and achieve economic recovery. Eventually, China will return to the top 3. But I think this is a useful corrective at the outset to have communicated that it's not all about China all the time. And that might maybe dull some of the ambition that we see from Beijing.
But in terms of what you've seen so far over the first 6 months, how do you evaluate what the Biden team has done, and what kind of a grade would you give them?
I'm pleased. Early on, we heard from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who said, we are assessing the approach that the Trump administration has taken. We will keep what was effective and we will modify where we think we need to. As an American citizen, I'm proud of that answer, because that suggests that we're not playing political games with this very critical set of issues. So it's early. We haven't even had the midterm, so we can't give a grade. But I would say the outliers, the wild cards, are the degree to which some of the issues which were not a priority in the Trump administration become priorities, and how they affect the overall mix. So as Tiffany mentioned, that some of the human rights issues, Xinjiang, for instance, and the degree to which the US considers and perhaps mobilizes others to not take part in the Beijing Olympics. A retrograde effort, perhaps, with regard to Hong Kong, a hardening of support for Taiwan. That's less a human rights issue, though there's certainly human rights dimensions. These are all factors that could shape that grade as we get to the midterm exam, in 6 months or so.
So Tiffany, if you were forced to give a pre-midterm grade, how would you assess Biden and his team so far?
I would plead that I'm an Australian citizen. That would get me out of this question. I think, as Roy mentioned, I think we're kind of going back to, I think, a more balanced approach in US-China relations, where we're not focused on just singular issues. We're able to walk and chew gum, if you will, to address, I think, the US values on the human rights, to address the importance of allies and partners, to compete with China. It's in technology space, for example. So I think we're seeing a much more balanced approach to competing with China. I think, we've seen a lot of continuity. I think one is the recent executive order ban to prevent US entities from doing business with Chinese entities that are affiliated with the PLA, and that was actually an expansion of what we've seen under the Trump administration. So I do agree that there's a lot of continuity, and part of this is, I think, it's a long time coming in US-China relations. I'm sorry. I'm curious, there's a debate in Washington about the extent to which Xi Jinping, the president, the leader of China, is driving the more assertive and aggressive behavior that China is engaging in. And then some other people think that, no, it's China, the system, the top leadership has evolved, and Xi is just representing that. Tiffany, do you have a sense of whether is this Xi Jinping, and when Xi Jinping eventually leaves the scene, China will shift, or is this China, the system writ large, has become more confident and changing the way it behaves? I think it's both. So on the one part, I think it is to do with Xi Jinping. So, we've seen in previous Chinese leadership where they have a different sort of mantra for engaging with the world. And under Deng Xiaoping, we had the hide and bide, and under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, we've had the sort of peaceful rise. Under Xi, he has personalized this concept of the China dream, which encompasses and I think drives a lot of China's external strategy right now. So I don't think that's going to go away with Xi. Some of the Xi Jinping thought has now been incorporated into the constitution, for example. So that's not going to go away after Xi Jinping is gone, if and when, I guess the question is, that's going to be, because he's now in power indefinitely. I do think it's also in part the Chinese system, right? Because we've gotten to a place where China has evolved and has more power, I think, than it ever has in recent decades. And China is finding ways to use that power to get what it's want, to, coerce its neighbors, to put itself high, elevate itself on the international stage. So I think it's kind of a confluence of this ambitious and strong leader that's intent on consolidating his own power, and also really having the capability to be able to assert his ambitions. Roy, when Biden hosted Xi Jinping, a number of years ago and took him to Iowa, he described Xi Jinping as a new kind of Chinese leader. And then during the US presidential campaign, he called Xi Jinping a thug. How do you think we should view Xi Jinping, and how do you think Biden should deal with him when they eventually, at some point, have a bilateral summit?
So, again, a good question. That calling foreign leaders names as a prelude to meeting them in person, in my view, is not a great strategy. We saw that just last week with Putin, for instance. You can tell Tiffany and I have spent many hours sitting in years ago talking about these issues. I agree with her assessment. She is unique. He's maybe the most qualified that emerges from their system. And so he's not the kind of person who came from outside the system. He is a product of it, and those around him are products, and they are effective in pursuing the aims for the Chinese Communist Party. So how does Biden be effective in a one-on-one meeting with Xi? Yeah, I think of when the famous dinner when President Trump hosted Xi Jinping, and then over that delicious chocolate cake, Trump said to Xi, "Oh, by the way, we've just launched 57 cruise missiles against targets in Syria. Just wanted you to know, here's some coffee with your chocolate cake." That I'm not suggesting that's how we handle all of our issues, but in that context, it conveyed the clear meaning to Xi that there's only one country in the world that can do this, and you're not it. We are. And this ought to be some sort of governor, a brake on your ambitions. Not to suggest that the United States is targeting China or do such a, that's not the point. It's more the sense that she has that maybe these relative changes are not happening as quickly as his people might be telling them.
Maybe we can switch to Taiwan, one of the core interests. And I've got a kind of a question about, whether we should be preparing for conflict. But there's a question that's come in from Jocelyn Ford, which is to what degree is Xi Jinping's ambition for historic political legacy driving policy towards Taiwan? Tiffany, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think, Xi Jinping is the latest in a long line of Chinese leaders that have thought about the importance of unification is sort of central to Chinese territorial integrity, and also to sort of avenging the century of humiliation that I think is the undercurrent that runs through a lot of what we see in terms of Chinese propaganda. So I do think in terms of the cross-strait scenario, I mean, Xi Jinping has sort of put his own stamp on it. He's made Taiwan sort of an integral part of the China dream. He calls the two sides of the strait two sides of the same family. And, he's also put a timeline on the Taiwan issue, albeit very vaguely, by saying, as part of the China dream, by 2049 centennial of the founding of the PRC, that this is kind of the notional timeline for incorporating lost territories, which is kind of a reference to Taiwan. So we've seen that under Xi, that China has taken a more bellicose and hardline approach. And, this is in part because of the DPP taking power in Taiwan and concern from Beijing that Taiwan is going to sort of drift further away from China under a DPP administration, if you will. But I think Xi is very much driven by a historical agenda. And if he can resolve the Taiwan issue, I mean, that helps to bolster legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its survival. And, that is actually, I think, the number one goal and concern, which is the continuity of the CCP and how that survives, and how Taiwan is sort of one part of helping that.
Roy, if you think back to when Trump came into power 4 years ago, a lot of the security conversations about Asia were focused on North Korea. It's been quite amazing to see how the last 6 months, it's all been about Taiwan, almost nothing on North Korea. Admiral Davidson, the recently departed head of Indo-PACOM, said he thought China could invade or attack Taiwan within 6 years. A senior US official told the FT a couple of months ago that they thought Xi Jinping was flirting with the idea of seizing control of Taiwan. And then last week, General Milley seemed to play down some of those concerns and said China is not about to do this, and actually doesn't even have the military capability to do so. Where do you think, obviously this is all speculation, but on that spectrum, where do you think we are?
I think it's not the preference of the Politburo Standing Committee to use military force to unify with Taiwan, because they've thought about the day after and the years after, and they understand that that will be an entirely different world if they achieve the unification that Tiffany talked about using military means. That doesn't mean they won't if certain red lines are crossed. That doesn't mean that they're that far from being able to accomplish it, even in a fait accompli kind of lightning quick operation, although I'm personally not persuaded that that would be the pathway. So is military action against Taiwan a possibility? It certainly is. The weaknesses that I stated notwithstanding, if the party gives the order, the PLA will try. And once it begins, it's not something that can be, it's not a military operation that can be defeated and we go back to the status quo ante. It's an entirely different world. And once they commence, the PLA will not end its military efforts until it achieves its goals. And that's quite a sobering thought to contemplate. It does suggest that we in the US, Indo-PACOM and others have to think about more than days 1 through 3, right? We have to think about months 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm not sure we've done that for a very long time. We tend to think in terms of how do we deter the immediate operation before we can get our reinforcements in the area of operations. And so I guess that's where I am. We have to be careful that we don't try to reassure ourselves about what the PLA might do and what on the orders of the standing committee. And yet we also don't want to give them more credit than is due based on what we understand of their capabilities. So it's a fine line. Admiral Davidson's point, I think there's a backstory there that is rooted in classified information. And, I just think we need more detail to understand why he was so precise when talking about the 6-year window. I tend to think it's related as much to developing US capabilities that will come online at a later point than it is about having some exquisite intelligence that suggests the Chinese have a plan within the next 2,000 days.
So Tiffany, how do you view things? Do you think CEOs of corporations around the world and everyone else should be worried about conflict over Taiwan in the near future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we've actually been asked that by a CEO of a major American company. And, war over Taiwan is an ongoing concern that I hear a lot, but to date, I'm not persuaded that we have the evidence to suggest that it's imminent. First of all, China has unfortunately developed and refined quite a large toolbox of gray zone and other tactics to pressure Taiwan. And all of these are lower cost for China than an outright invasion option. So I think for now, China has the ability to pressure Taiwan without the threat of military conflict. And as Roy mentioned, China's ultimate preference would be to pressure Taipei to capitulate without using force, although this does seem to be very unlikely given trends and sentiments in Taiwan, which seems to lean away from unification with China. And a war over Taiwan is not going to be easy. And it's very possible that victory is not guaranteed. And US and other countries' support for Taiwan, I think, actually boosts deterrence against the PRC. I mean, it's deterring war, even if it's not entirely deterring China from using these gray zone tactics. And China is trying very hard to shape this narrative, is trying to convince Taiwan's allies and friends that Taiwan is not worth defending. And that's all part of its attempt to isolate Taiwan. And this is extremely dangerous because it not only pressures Taiwan, but propagates this narrative about inevitability of unification as a rightful course of history from Beijing's end, and really distracts, I think, from the truth, which is an autocratic nation trying to annex a democratic one.
So Tiffany,
jump in
go ahead, please.
You framed that question by saying when the Trump administration came to power, all we talked about was North Korea, and now it's all about Taiwan. That phenomenon itself serves Beijing's interests. China was in a very risky position when there was a one-on-one meeting between the American president and Kim Jong-un. There was a real sense in Beijing that they might have gotten cut out of a direct deal, and that's the last thing China can live with. It regards North Korea that there's no communist brotherhood between China and Beijing, between China and North Korea. It's all about the territory that North Korea occupies that serves as a buffer between the United States and her ally in South Korea. And so that we don't talk about North Korea absolutely serves Chinese interests at the moment.
Mhm. Well, so I have a ton more questions, but there's a bunch coming in the chat. So let me address some of those and put them to you. One question is that some experts think the PLA might first take action against the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. China is putting a lot of money into amphibious assault vehicles, and that it would be good practice for any kind of an attack invasion of Taiwan. Tiffany, what do you think? Is China likely to do something on the Senkakus as a prelude to something on Taiwan later?
I don't think so, and that's really not how Chinese thinking has evolved, which is historically been planning for a Taiwan scenario. I mean, I think a conflict of the Senkakus is a very different outcome, contingency for the PLA, because the United States has pledged that Article 5 of its Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan does cover the Senkakus. So, you know, while in the Taiwan Strait scenario, there's always a little bit of question of what the US would do in the case of a war, I think in the Senkaku example, it's extremely clear. So it doesn't seem logical to me that they would get bogged down in a war of the Senkakus as a practice.
Roy, just to piggyback on that and bring it back to Taiwan just for 1 second, do you think, so the US has made clear that Article 5 of the Defense Treaty applies to the Senkaku. Do you think the Biden administration has done enough to make clear to China that any military action against Taiwan would trigger a strong US response, or at least the suggestion that that's what would happen?
Yeah, this is important. The assertion that Article 5 applies is under the condition that Japan maintains administrative control of the Senkakus. It's not a judgment about the sovereignty of the Senkakus. It's that the US will assist Japan as long as they have administrative control. And how do you prove administrative control, right? The reason there's so much Chinese Coast Guard pressure on the Senkakus, incursions into the contiguous zone and territorial zone, is precisely to try to disprove or to prove that Japan has administrative control. The same sort of condition, and bear in mind in 2013, when the pressure was really mounting on Japan, is when President Obama and the chairman of Joint Chiefs made this statement. And at the time, the pressure really declined dramatically because the assertion of what the United States would do served a great deterrent value. As it applies to Taiwan, the question is, will an assertion of what the United States will do in certain contingencies, will that achieve the same outcome? This is the question of, do we retain strategic ambiguity, or do we change to a policy of strategic clarity?
But is that question because the Senkaku, Taiwan is a core interest for China, and the Senkaku, as much as China is interested in Senkaku, it's not a core interest?
I think it's certainly related to that. It's also the case, though, that a declaration in the case of Taiwan would only confirm in Beijing's mind what it believes it already knows, dating back to the cross-strait crisis of 95, 96. They have already factored in that the United States will be involved in any sort of military clash. And that they would proceed under those circumstances underscores the point you just made, which is it's that important to them, and other issues probably are not. So do we change our longstanding policy? Do we achieve more deterrent value by declaring what we would do, or do we maintain some degree of ambiguity because there are conditions? We can't lay out the conditions under which we would do so and which we wouldn't. For instance, if the leadership in Taiwan, President Tsai has been a remarkable president, but if a different president were to take very risky actions, the U.S. would have sort of painted itself into a corner if it had said under any circumstances it would assist Taiwan. So I think it's my own view is our longstanding policy of strategic ambiguity continues to serve our interests the best.
Let me take a question from Ted Alden, who is also a former partner in crime at the Financial Times in Washington. And Ted says, Roy, could you give some specific examples of where you believe the US was overly complacent when it came to China?
I think the clearest one is in the South China Sea. In 2010, at the ASEAN Regional Forum in July in Hanoi, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "This is the United States principles that governs our interactions in the South China Sea and how we believe that countries ought to interact here. There should be freedom of navigation for all, freedom of seas. There should be no coercion, and any outcomes should be achieved peaceably." And I'm convinced the Chinese went back, studied the situation, and concluded these were not a set of principles that the United States would fight for. When the then Pacific Command commander said in a public statement, "We are not going to war over a pile of rocks," I think that confirmed to the Chinese leadership that we were not in a position to resist, or we didn't see the need to resist the island building campaign, which has led then to the militarization of those 7 features. So we didn't understand what was happening as it began to unfold, and we didn't understand the final set of outcomes. Now we learned, right? Because the island building took place 2013, 2014, early 15. By the second Scarborough incident in 2016, we pushed back pretty hard. We messaged Beijing and said, "You should not do this." We did forced deployment operations in the region and conveying our willingness to use force, and that's always a delicate balance. And Beijing stopped short. And so I think you contrast the two, and we have a sense that the earlier period, I don't know if complacent's the best word, but we were certainly not as, we weren't leaning forward and anticipating the challenges we ought to have been.
Interesting. Okay. Tiffany, just to go back to Taiwan, there's a question which is, some people think that Xi Jinping may be increasing coercion on Japan as a scapegoat to divert the internal pressure on the CCP as the party prepares to embrace its, the 20th Party Congress next year, and I guess the 100th anniversary this year. Do you think that's what's happening?
Increased coercion on Taiwan or Japan as a scapegoat?
Oh, I'm sorry, on Taiwan.
Okay. I think the increase of coercive pressures against Taiwan, far precedes any lead up to the 20th Party Congress last year. Next year, I'm sorry. I think when we really saw it started was 2016, when the Tsai administration came into power. That marked a significant ramping up of military and economic pressures. And, in the last election, we also saw another uptick in terms of political interference. So in terms of using Taiwan as a scapegoat, I suppose it could be convenient, but at the same time, I don't think that's the only reason for the pressures on Taiwan. And I think the main reason is Xi Jinping's view of the China dream and how he wants to secure his legacy, and any concerns that Taiwan is drifting away from China.
Okay. Another question, maybe for you, Roy. Alistair asks, the conversation, we've been focused heavily on Taiwan, but would advancing China's territorial interest in the South China Sea beyond Taiwan be militarily more achievable, given that the Philippines and Vietnam are weaker?
Those ambitions, I think, are limited. We are in a new status quo. China has achieved largely what it hopes to achieve. There are, I think, important issues west in the Indian Ocean and north in the East China Sea, and of course, with Taiwan. I'm just not persuaded that at this point in time, there's certainly no rollback we can accomplish. And so we have to think about bolstering our partners and allies so that it's a more difficult challenge. But strategically, there's not much more to be gained.
Can I ask you both, just again, sticking on Taiwan for a second, or back to Taiwan. When I was living in Hong Kong during the October or the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, I don't think anyone I talked to expected that China would kind of crack down on the pro-democracy movement and implement a national security law with the speed that they have done. Is there any lessons to be drawn from that in terms of when you look at what China might or might not do vis-a-vis Taiwan? What does the experience in Hong Kong tell us about that? Maybe Tiffany, you could address that.
Sure. I think the lesson in Hong Kong is one country, two systems is, it's not what it's promised. I think a lot, to put it very diplomatically, I think it's viewed, in Taiwan especially, as more of a reason for them to not want unification with China, just seeing what happened in Hong Kong. And that actually played into the last Taiwan elections as well. There's a lot of concern with what's happening in Hong Kong. I mean, we're seeing China erode a lot of civil liberties and freedoms in Hong Kong under the new national security law. We're seeing thousands of people being persecuted under this as well, just for supporting democracy. They're being tried under secession and terrorism charges. So, I think it's very clear, the lessons of Hong Kong is that under one country, two systems, the other party is no longer autonomous from China and can no longer sort of function with its democratic freedoms that actually made it so appealing in the first place.
Dimitri,
Roy, do you think that?
I think it's also the case that they're very different circumstances, as Tiffany noted. Hong Kong was under Chinese control. It acted very quickly because it could. And there was precious little the international community and the West could do, except bloviate about how unjust this was. And that's a very different circumstance from Taiwan.
No, fair enough. One question I wanted to ask you both. We're talking about whether China has the intent to do something vis-a-vis Taiwan. How capable do you think the Chinese military is? I mean, the Chinese Navy is now bigger than the US Navy, and I know that's not the be-all and end-all, but it is one metric that I think probably 10, 15 years ago, people would not have expected. So how capable do you think the Chinese military is, and what should concern the US the most about its development? Sorry, Tiffany, or would you like to take that, or?
I think you're right. I mean, I think with the double-digit sort of defense spending and modernization effort that the PLA has undergone, we're looking at certainly a much more capable force. When we talk about conflict against Taiwan, many people think that we'll start with, for example, blockades. So as you noted, China has been shoring up its naval capabilities, but I also want to point to the fact that China also has been shoring up its capabilities in cyberspace and electronic warfare, in terms of strike capability, and those are all important developments. And those are capabilities that they didn't have in the 90s during the Taiwan Strait crisis, and that would absolutely come into play, perhaps even before a kinetic action. We might see some psychological warfare campaigns. We might see some cyber attacks, for example, electronic jamming efforts. So I do think they have a lot more tools in the toolbox, unfortunately.
Roy, can I ask you about India? I mean, one of the things Biden has done is take the Quad, US, India, Japan, and Australia, which Trump reinvigorated, and take it to the next level. Do you think, this is a question from Stefan, do you think India realistically can be a strong partner in the Quad and actually help the US and its other allies or partners counter China in the Indo-Pacific?
India still suffers, you might say, from its non-aligned hangover. There are real allergies to thinking about partnerships, even with the United States. Bear in mind, much of India's foreign imported military systems are still Russian in design. This imperative to internally balance against great powers is still a very strong instinct in India. It's also the case that India's strategic community was woken up last summer in ways that hadn't really taken place, perhaps since the 1962 border war. it seems to me that the Biden administration's approach to talk about the Quad in terms of a coordination mechanism, not as a nascent security structure, is intended as a message to India. And that go slow approach is intended to not turn off India too soon. Now, I mean, the devastating effects of COVID have sort of put the brakes on all of this anyway. And so it's going to be a while before I think India can think in these terms. So it's still, there's still a ways to go.
Tiffany, a question from Henry Tillman, which is, while the Western press covered the G7, NATO, and the Putin meetings, there was virtually no Western press covering the 20th anniversary of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which recently hosted its 40,000th China-Asia train over the past decade. Someday these rails, roads, etc., will be digitized as part of the digital Silk Road. What is your view of that? Are people not paying enough attention to these other things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think historically Central Asia suffers from a lack of attention, both in public discourse and I think oftentimes within the government as well. I mean, I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the fact that I'm not sure if China has been putting much more effort into that because a lot of the focus on Central Asia and beyond has sort of been through the Belt and Road Initiative and more focus on economic investment and infrastructure development necessarily than defense cooperation through the SCO. But I think Roy probably has a bit more familiarity with this topic.
No pressure, Roy.
It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? That we tend to focus on what we know and not perhaps what is equally consequential. I think we have to be mindful of what China hopes to achieve within the Eurasian landmass and the means of integrating Central Asia with Eastern Europe. And all of the methods that China is seeking to employ to accomplish that will achieve some great effect at the point at which they achieve that effect. And we can't just tune in, before the last couple railroad ties are driven somewhere in Eastern Europe. We have to be thinking in very strategic ways about these consequential developments.
Well, listen, we're getting close to the end, but just before I hand over to Noor to close out with his remarks, can I ask you both, Tiffany and Roy, what has surprised you most about US-China relations over the last 6 months?
Maybe I'll go first. I don't know about 6 months, but if I can, I think what surprised me most in recent years is I think what we've seen is the bipartisan consensus on China's as a competitor to the United States and how it challenges US interests. I mean, I think that's, while it's been a long time coming, it happened rather quickly, I think, in the last couple of years. And that was something that I had not expected to see for a very long time, personally. And I think that it was a good reset. I think it puts us on a good trajectory.
Good. Roy?
And my issue that I've been surprised at is that Beijing assessed that the reset could itself be reset, that somehow the Biden administration would undo fundamentally what the Trump administration had sought to do in achieving that reset. It was more a triumph of hope over reality. And I think I heard someone say earlier today in a call, Xi Jinping has to ask himself sometimes, who's responsible for us losing the US? That what is it about the composite nature of all the things we've done, our policies, domestic and regionally, that have caused this hardening on the part of the United States to China? I'm surprised that they're they're still coming to grips with this question and don't understand the ways in which Chinese policy and practice have really brought about this very tough set of circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Great. Well, listen, before I hand over to Noor, only thing I have to do is to thank both Tiffany and Roy for your insights and your time. And thank you very much. Over to you, Noor.
Great. And Dimitri, as you thanks the panelists, I'd like to thank you very much for doing an excellent job of moderating today. It was an excellent discussion. I think we all benefited from it. And I think we took particularly the sensitive topic of Taiwan, we took it head on and really hit some of the key issues on it. So I think it was an excellent discussion. Again, I want to thank not only the panelists and moderator, but also NBR and Jennifer for helping us put this together. And as I mentioned earlier in the program, I look forward to doing programs with NBR in the future. So again, thanks everybody for your participation. Let's do it again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.